Rotten Tomatoes seems to be the default tool the average person uses to gauge whether or not a movie is worth their time. I don't know why, and I wish it wasn't, but it seems to be. And I genuinely think it's not great, because I also get the feeling that most people don't really know how Rotten Tomatoes actually works, and that's a bit of a problem. Because if they did, if people were informed, it would be less bad, but still not great, because the whole system it uses is, in my opinion, flawed. And honestly, even misleading. And it was designed that way, and I think that sucks. Especially considering that there are better alternatives out there. And they've actually been around for longer. But somehow Rotten Tomatoes wormed its way into the collective consciousness and became the default option for many people to quickly assess the quality of a movie. And it's great that it exists, and that these things in general exist, so that we don't need to walk in blindly to a theater as paying customers, and so that we don't need to rely on that one local critic and what he thinks. So overall, critic and audience score aggregators are absolutely fantastic inventions, and I love them. They genuinely make my life better and provide value to me. So what's the issue here? What's my beef with Rotten Tomatoes? Well, the problem is that Rotten Tomatoes kind of tells you whether or not the movie is at least decent, but that's about it. It doesn't really accurately distinguish between a great movie and a good movie. At least not in an accurate and useful way. Because even just a decent movie could theoretically have a 100% fresh rating. The same also goes for distinguishing between movies that are not very good and absolutely terrible ones, that no one should sit through. But why is that? Why does it work that way? Well, it's because if a critic gives a movie anything above a 6 out of 10, that's a fresh. A 8 out of 10 is also fresh. And a 10 out of 10 is still just fresh. And if every critic agrees that a movie is decent, it's gonna get a 100% fresh rating. Which means that, at least theoretically, 100 critics could all give a movie a 6 out of 10, and it would be a 100% fresh. Which is the same as a movie where 100 critics give it a 10 out of 10. Now, I think we can all agree that a movie everyone considers a 10 out of 10 is not the same as one that everyone agrees is a 6 out of 10. But in the eyes of Rotten Tomatoes, and because of how it inherently works, those two hypothetical movies are both just classified as 100% certified fresh. And I just don't think that's a very good way of handling things. I don't think it gives the audience accurate information. And I think it misleads people into watching movies they normally wouldn't watch. They waste time on movies they don't really want to see. Meanwhile, if you look at these two same hypothetical movies, on let's say Metacritic for instance, another critic aggregator site, one that's been around for a very long time. The first movie we mentioned would have a score of 60, not 100% certified fresh. And the other one would have a score of 100, which at least in my eyes makes a hell of a lot more sense, and is far more representative of the actual review scores given, and how the movie has actually been received overall. It tells you exactly what's going on, what the critics actually think of the movie, and it does so with one simple, intuitive, and easy to understand number. And the same goes for user ratings too. Rotten Tomatoes has the same exact problem there. But if you look at like IMDb for instance, the first hypothetical movie would be a 6 out of 10, and the other one a 10 out of 10. But on Rotten Tomatoes both would be 100% certified fresh. Now, with this knowledge in hand, which system do you think more accurately reflects the actual consensus of the masses? Rotten Tomatoes or Metacritic and IMDb? And more importantly, which one do you think is more useful to the end user, meaning you, the consumer? The person who wants to know whether or not the movie is worth your precious time and money. Do you really think that a system which treats a very average but decent movie the same as a masterpiece is a great system that should be the default go-to app for the average person? Is that the website or app that you should use to gauge whether or not to spend your entire evening watching a particular movie? I personally don't think so. And I really don't know how this happened either. And to be completely honest, I don't think it'll change at this point either. I don't think a video like this will have that much impact, even if it somehow miraculously got millions of views. But I just feel like people should at least be aware of how the system they're using actually works, so that they know that a 100% fresh rating doesn't mean that every critic thinks the movie is a masterpiece, or that even one critic thinks it's a great movie, because everyone could in fact just agree that it's a solid, decent movie, and that's it. But that's not how a 100% certified fresh rating sounds to me, and probably not to most other people either. And I would hazard a guess that most people would probably assume that the movie is a genuine masterpiece, and that's why they choose to spend money to go see it in the theater. They might even have to book a babysitter, and they might spend their only free night of the week going to see a perfectly average and mediocre movie. And that's just not right. Now I do acknowledge that my example was hypothetical and extreme, and that in reality no movie would get all 6 out of 10 ratings, and that in fact some would probably rate it lower, bringing down the score from that perfect 100. However, I used it to illustrate my point, which is that Rotten Tomatoes, in my eyes, is fundamentally flawed, and actually misleading, and therefore not a very useful tool. But here's a real-life example from an actual movie that came out a little while ago. It's called Mountainhead, a film by Jesse Armstrong, and one where I actually agree with the critics. It was decent, but definitely not great. And as of writing this, Metacritic has it at a 66, and I would have personally probably given it a 6.5 out of 10, which is decent but nothing special. But this translates to a 80% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, which to me at least sounds pretty damn great. But the critics didn't think it was pretty damn great. They thought it was decent, hence the 66 on Metacritic. Meanwhile, because the audiences enjoyed it less than critics, the IMDb score is sitting around 5.5, which is not great. In fact, it's kinda bad, but not god-awful. But again, this translates to a Rotten Tomatoes score of only 28%, which to me at least, and probably most people out there, sounds pretty awful. It doesn't sound like a movie worth checking out. And what's more, look at the discrepancy between the critic score and the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. The critics think it's a 80%, and the audiences think it's an abysmal 28%. Which would suggest that this movie is highly divisive between critics and audiences. But it's actually not. Sure, if you look at Metacritic's 66 and compare it to IMDb's 5.5, yeah, critics liked it a bit more than audiences. But everyone more or less agrees that the movie is pretty mid. But you'd never know that if your primary source for this stuff is Rotten Tomatoes. And that's why I think it kinda sucks. And you probably shouldn't use it. But if you do use it, at least now you know how it actually works. And you can take that into consideration when choosing what movies you want to spend your time watching. And that's really my big gripe here. That the Rotten Tomatoes system is kinda misleading. And because people might not necessarily understand how it works, they can't use it effectively to find movies they might actually enjoy. And as a result, people might waste their time watching movies that aren't particularly amazing. And they might also dismiss a perfectly good movie too. And that's a shame. And you know what else would be a shame? If you didn't hit that like button, and didn't comment below, and didn't sub to the channel for more content like this. But yeah, I think that's about it for today, and see you next time.